The letter arrived on a Tuesday, but Stella Maddox did not read it until Wednesday morning. And by then Oliver Underwood was already 3 miles down the Laramie road, riding hard into a horizon that offered nothing but dry grass and broken promises. She stood on the porch of the Silver Creek station house with the opened envelope in one hand and the single sheet of paper in the other, and the words on that paper rearranged everything she thought she understood about the last 6 weeks of her life. Her chest felt like someone had pressed a hot iron flat against it and held it there. The handwriting was not Oliver's. It belonged to Marshal Gideon Holt, a man she had never met but whose name she now hated with a ferocity that surprised her, and the words he had written were precise and cold and devastating. Miss Maddox, I write to inform you that the man calling himself a reformed gunslinger in your company is in fact Oliver Underwood, wanted on suspicion of the Copper Ridge Bank robbery of 1882. His association with your homestead and the Silver Creek freight operation may place you in considerable danger. I advise you to distance yourself immediately and report any information regarding his movements. The reward stands at $800. $800. She read the number twice and felt something inside her go very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still before a storm breaks, and there is nothing left to do but brace. She had trusted him. She had opened not just the station house door, but something considerably more difficult and more private than that. She had told him about her father's debt. She had shown him the ledger with the numbers that did not add up. She had laughed with him in the kitchen at midnight when neither of them could sleep, and she had let herself think, carefully and cautiously, that maybe the world was not entirely made of betrayal and hard luck and men who took things that did not belong to them. And now she held a letter that said all of that had been built on a hidden motive she never once suspected. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket and walked inside and sat down at the kitchen table and did not move for a long time. She did not know, because nobody told her, that Oliver Underwood had already turned back. He had been 3 miles down the Laramie road when something shifted in him, some instinct that had kept him alive through years of violent and stupid choices, and he had pulled his horse around without fully deciding to do it. He had told himself it was because he had forgotten to return the wire tool he had borrowed from her shed. He had told himself it was because the road looked worse up ahead and he should warn her about the washout near Miller's Creek. He told himself a great many things in those 3 miles of riding back, none of which were the real reason, and the real reason sat in his chest like an ember he could not name and could not extinguish. The real reason was Stella Maddox, but she did not know any of that yet. She sat at her kitchen table with her hands folded and her jaw set and the letter burning in her pocket, and she was preparing herself for the particular kind of grief that comes not from losing something you never had, but from discovering that what you thought you had was never quite real at all. She was 26 years old, and she had already survived one catastrophic betrayal when her late husband Cade Maddox had gambled away their savings, and then died of a fever before he could be held accountable for any of it. She had survived that. She was certain, with the bleak pragmatism that the frontier demands of its women, that she would survive this too. She was wrong about what she needed to survive, though. She was wrong about a great many things that morning, and the most important thing she was wrong about was currently riding back up her road with dust on his coat and an explanation he had no idea he owed her. 6 weeks earlier, Silver Creek had been a different kind of problem. The freight station that Stella's father, Thomas Maddox, had built in 1876 along the Wyoming Territory Road between Cheyenne and Laramie was, by the spring of 1883, operating at the edge of collapse. Thomas had died the previous autumn from a heart complaint, leaving Stella with a half-built reputation, a functional but aging set of horses, 3 part-time employees of questionable reliability, and a debt to the Territorial Savings Bank that made her stomach hurt every time she thought about it. She had come west originally not as a frontierswoman, but as a schoolteacher from St. Louis, following her father after her husband died, telling herself it was to help Thomas with the bookkeeping but understanding, in the honest hours before dawn, that she simply needed to be somewhere that did not remind her of Cade's face. The frontier had a way of grinding sentiment down into something more useful, and she had let it do that to her. She had learned to negotiate with freighters and argue with suppliers, and fire a Winchester rifle with enough accuracy to discourage the occasional opportunist who thought a woman alone meant an easy target. What she had not learned to do was ask for help without feeling like she was confessing to weakness. So when a lean, dark-haired man with a quiet manner and a Colt single-action Army revolver on his hip appeared at her gate on a Wednesday morning in early April and asked if she had any work that needed doing, her first instinct was to say no. Her second instinct was to look at the broken axle on wagon number 3 and the 3 fence posts that needed resetting and the accumulation of small, heavy, necessary tasks that had been waiting for a second pair of hands since February and to reconsider. "What kind of work do you do?" she asked. "Whatever kind needs doing," he said. "Carpentry, livestock, loading and unloading freight. I can drive a team if you need it. Can you shoe a horse competently?" She studied him for a moment. He was perhaps 29 or 30, with the kind of stillness that either meant deep peace or deep trouble, and in her experience those two things were harder to distinguish than people generally admitted. He wore his gun low on his right hip in a way that was not decorative. His hands were not soft. "You have a name," she said. "Oliver Underwood." "Where are you from, Oliver Underwood?" "Originally from Missouri," he said. "More recently from a number of places that wouldn't impress you." She almost smiled at that. "What are you running from?" He looked at her steadily. "What makes you think I'm running?" "Because every man who shows up at a freight station asking for whatever kind of work needs doing is either running from something or looking for someone," she said. "And you don't have the look of a man doing surveillance." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe both," he said finally. "Running from something and trying to find a different version of myself somewhere I haven't ruined yet." It was, she would reflect later, exactly the wrong thing to say if he wanted to keep her at a safe emotional distance. Because it was honest in the way that people rarely were with strangers, and she had spent years surrounded by men who spoke in performance and posture, and the simple directness of it landed on her like something she had not known she was waiting for. "I pay fair wages," she said. $2 a week plus meals. You sleep in the bunkhouse. You don't drink on the property. You don't touch anything that isn't your concern. And if you give me any reason to regret hiring you, I'll know about it before you've finished forming the thought, because I have been running this operation alone for 6 months, and I have gotten very good at reading situations quickly." "Understood," he said. "Good," she said. "The wagon axle is in the back. The tools are in the second shed." He nodded and walked toward the back of the property, and she stood watching him go with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral, telling herself she was simply making a practical decision. She was not wrong, exactly. She was also not entirely right. He was good with his hands in the way that only comes from years of necessity rather than deliberate skill building. Within the first 3 days, the axle was replaced, the fence posts were set, and he had identified a problem with the second water trough that she had not noticed, a slow leak that had been causing the ground to soften in a way that was going to create difficulties when the summer freight loads came through. He worked quietly and with focus, and he asked precise questions and did not ask imprecise ones. He was polite to her part-time hands, a young man named Dewey Birch who was 19 and enthusiastic but inexperienced, and a taciturn older man named Gus Pruitt who had worked for her father and stayed on out of loyalty and a shortage of better options. Oliver did not try to lead them. He did not try to establish himself. He simply did the work and let the work speak. By the end of the first week, Gus, who had spoken perhaps 40 words total in the 6 months Stella had been running the station, had said to Oliver, "You do good work. which from Gus was essentially a declaration of deep personal affection. It was in the second week that she began to notice other things. He rose before dawn every morning, and she could hear him moving in the yard, not restlessly but with purpose. Once, getting up early herself for a freight delivery, she had found him standing at the eastern fence line, watching the light come up over the hills, and there was something in his expression that she could not categorize, a kind of careful attention to something beautiful that did not fit easily with the gun on his hip or the coiled quality of his body, when strangers came onto the property. She had stopped beside him without thinking about it, and they had stood there in the early gray light for a few minutes without speaking, watching the sky change from dark blue to the particular shade of orange and rose that only exists in the high plains of the Wyoming territory, and it had been one of the more companionable silences of her adult life. "You should see this more often," he said finally. "I'm usually in the kitchen by now," she said. "That's what I mean." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the horizon. His expression was open in a way it generally wasn't during the daylight hours when work was happening. "You get philosophical before dawn," she said. "I get honest before dawn," he said. "It's easier when there's nobody around to perform for." "I'm around," she said. He glanced at her then. "Yes," he said, "but you already saw through the performance the first day." She did not know what to do with that, so she went back inside and made coffee and did not think about it for the rest of the morning, which was a deliberate and only partially successful effort. The books were the thing that truly broke the distance between them, though she would not have predicted that. In her father's study, which she now used as an office, she kept a small collection of books that she had carried west in a trunk. George Eliot's Middlemarch, a volume of Tennyson, a dog-eared copy of Moby Dick that she had never actually finished, a history of the Napoleonic campaigns that had been her father's, and a few others. She had not had time to read much since taking over the station, but the books were there as a kind of promise to herself about the kind of life she intended to eventually have. Oliver had been helping her carry a desk back from the shed, where she had moved it for a repair, and when they set it down in the office, he had seen the books on the shelf and stopped. "You've read Middlemarch," he said. It was not quite a question. "Twice," she said. "You have." "Once," he said. "A woman in Kansas City lent it to me. She thought I needed to understand something about the interior lives of people who make bad decisions with noble intentions." "Did it work?" He was quiet for a moment. "It made me understand it better," he said. "It didn't change it." She sat down behind the desk. "What bad decision are you referring to?" He ran a hand along the spine of the book without taking it from the shelf. "Copper Ridge," he said, and the name came out of him like something that had been waiting for a long time to be said. She did not know what Copper Ridge was yet. She would learn it in fragments over the following days and then all at once from the marshal's letter, but in that moment it was simply a name that clearly carried weight. "You don't have to tell me," she said. "I know," he said. He turned and looked at her directly. "I want to," and so he did. Not all at once, and not in the way of a formal confession, but piece by piece over 3 evenings, and a series of conversations that moved from the office to the kitchen table to the porch, as the spring evenings slowly stretched longer and warmer. He told her about growing up in Missouri with a father who believed that the railroad companies and the banks were the true criminals of the American West, and that anyone who took from them was simply leveling an unjust account. He told her about falling in with a group of men in his early 20s who shared that belief with the added conviction that righteousness required action. He told her about the years of riding, the jobs, the increasingly uncomfortable gap between the ideology and the reality of what they were doing, which was frightening ordinary people and taking money that mostly belonged to depositors rather than institutions. He told her about Copper Ridge. "I was there," he said. "I was outside. I was supposed to be the one who kept the horses ready." He looked at his hands. I told myself for a long time that being outside meant I hadn't really done it, that I hadn't gone through that door, that I hadn't pointed a gun at anyone." He paused, but people inside were terrified, and I held the horses, so I was part of it. "What happened after?" she asked. "I rode out," he said. "The group broke up. 3 of the men were caught within the year." "I wasn't." He looked up at her. "I've spent the last 14 months trying to figure out what a person does with that. Whether you run from it or turn yourself in or try to build something different and just carry it." "What have you decided?" she said. "I haven't," he said. "Not fully. That's why I'm here, I suppose, trying to build something different and see if it takes." She was quiet for a long time after that. The lamp was low and the night outside was full of spring frogs and the distant sound of cattle and the particular deep silence of a place that is very far from anywhere. "I think carrying it is its own kind of punishment," she said finally, "provided you actually carry it and don't just use the carrying of it as a story that makes you interesting." He looked at her sharply. Then something in his expression eased. "That is a very precise thing to say. I've met men who mistake guilt for depth," she said. "They are extremely boring to talk to." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, a genuine one, short and surprised out of him, and it changed his face completely. He looked younger. He looked like someone who had once been a great deal more straightforward than his life had required him to become. "You're not boring to talk to," he said. "I know," she said. And they sat with that for a moment before she went inside to lock up and he walked back to the bunkhouse. And neither of them said anything about what was becoming increasingly obvious, which was that they had a great deal more to say to each other than freight schedules and fence post specifications. By the 4th week, the situation had developed in the way that situations develop between two people who are both paying close attention to each other and both pretending with determined sincerity that they are doing nothing of the sort. He began to leave small things in places she would find them. Not gifts exactly, more like gestures. The water bucket inside the kitchen door before she had to go out for it in the morning. A note in the logbook correcting an addition error she had made in the freight accounts, written in his neat, precise hand without comment or fanfare. The front step, which had been slightly loose, suddenly firm and quiet when she walked across it. She was not a woman who was easily overwhelmed by kindness, having spent years developing a careful armor against hoping for it. But these small attentions accumulated in her like drops of water wearing stone, steady and persistent, and eventually transformative. She began to leave things too. She left coffee made the way he liked it, which she had observed without discussing. She left a book on the office desk with a note that said simply, "For when the evenings are slow. I thought you'd appreciate the 3rd chapter." She found herself consulting him about operational decisions not because she needed his input, but because she enjoyed the quality of his thinking, which was careful and lateral and occasionally surprising. Dewey Birch noticed it first, because 19-year-old boys who are romantically inexperienced themselves are nonetheless extremely observant about the romantic situations of the people around them. He said to Gus, with the gravity of someone making an important scientific observation, "Mr. Underwood looks at Miss Maddox like she's the only thing worth looking at in the whole territory." Gus said, "Mind your business." Dewey minded his business for approximately 48 hours and then said, "And she does the same thing, only she's better at pretending she's not." Gus did not respond, but he had noticed it too, and he had his own complicated feelings about it, chief among them the hope that it would work out, because Thomas Maddox's daughter deserved something good, and Gus was old enough to have watched enough people miss their good things through stubbornness and fear to feel urgency about not watching it happen again. The evening that things shifted undeniably was a night in early May, when a late spring storm rolled in from the north without much warning and hit the station like something personally antagonistic. The horses needed settling, the supply shed needed its door braced, and the main house had a window shutter that had come loose and was banging dangerously in the wind. They worked side by side in the rain for 2 hours, and it was the kind of shared physical effort in bad conditions that strips away the careful management people maintain around each other and leaves something more essential underneath. By the time they had gotten everything secured and the horses calm and themselves back inside the main house, because the bunkhouse had developed a leak, and she had told him flatly not to sleep in water, they were both soaked through and somewhat breathless and sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen fire with their wet coats hung up and the storm raging outside. She had poured them both a measure of rye whiskey from the bottle she kept locked in the pantry for exceptional circumstances, and they had sat drinking it in the firelight and talking, really talking, the way that becomes possible when ordinary defenses are wet and cold and temporarily unavailable. She told him about Cade. Not the polished version she gave to curious neighbors, which was "my husband passed and I came west to help my father," but the real version. The gambling, the borrowed money she had not known about, the way she had found out not from Cade but from his creditors, the particular specific betrayal of discovering that the person closest to you has been running a hidden life in the space right beside your real one. "I don't trust easily anymore," she said. It was not an accusation or a warning. It was simply true. "I know," he said. "But I trust you," she said, and then looked directly at the fire as if she had not said it, as if it were a perfectly ordinary observation that required no follow-up. The silence that followed had a particular texture to it, weighted and alive. "Stella," he said. She did not look at him. "Look at me," he said quietly. She looked at him. The firelight was doing complicated things to the planes of his face, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, direct and unguarded. All of that careful stillness stripped away by 2 hours in the rain, and a measure of whiskey and the thing between them that had been building for weeks, and was now apparently unwilling to be managed any further. "I didn't come here with a hidden motive," he said. "I want you to know that. Whatever you might eventually find out about my past, what is happening here is not strategic. It is the most genuinely unstrategic thing I have done in years." "What is happening here?" she said. "I think you know," he said. "I know what I think is happening," she said carefully. "I want to know if we're thinking the same thing." He looked at her steadily. "I think about you," he said. "I think about you when I'm working. I think about things I want to tell you. I think about whether you're sleeping enough and whether the accounts are stressing you and whether the bay mare's leg is bothering you today because I saw you watching her this morning." He paused. "That is either what I think it is, or I am considerably more domesticated than I was aware." She pressed her lips together against something that was either a smile or a response to being moved, or possibly both. For a man who is allegedly running from his own life, you pay a great deal of attention to other people's details. "Your details specifically," he said. She set her glass down on the table between them. "Oliver," she said, "I am a woman with a freight business, a bank debt, a complicated history, and approximately no patience for half measures or ambiguity. So if you are going to say something, say it plainly." He held her gaze. "I am in love with you," he said. In the same tone he might have used to state a fact about weather or geography, completely without decoration, as if it were simply something true that needed acknowledging. "I understand if that is inconvenient or unwelcome given the circumstances." She was quiet for a moment. The storm outside made the windows rattle. The fire popped and settled. "It is not unwelcome," she said. "It is somewhat terrifying, but it is not unwelcome." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over beneath his, and they stayed like that while the storm shook the house, and it was the most comfortable Stella Maddox had felt in years. That was 3 weeks before the letter arrived. The 3 weeks between the storm-lit kitchen and the letter were, she would later think, the most uncomplicated and quietly joyful weeks of her adult life. They did not make dramatic declarations or rush toward anything. They were too old for that, both of them, and too careful. But the distance between them changed, became something warmer and more intentional. They took their evening coffee on the porch together as a regular habit rather than a coincidence. He walked beside her when she went to check the horses rather than a step behind. When he disagreed with her decisions, he said so directly, and she argued back, and neither of them took it as a personal affront, which was itself a kind of intimacy that she had not found easy to come by. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday afternoon when they were arguing about whether to take on a third freight contract that she thought was overextending them, and he thought they could manage if they structured it correctly. They were standing in the office, she behind the desk and he in front of it, and she had made a point she was particularly pleased with, and he had looked at her for a moment with that expression that she was beginning to recognize, the one where he seemed to be making a deliberate decision, and then he had simply walked around the desk and kissed her. Not desperately or dramatically, but with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything he did, and it lasted long enough that she had completely lost the thread of the argument by the time it was finished. "I'm still right about the contract," she said. "You are," he said. "I'll write to decline them tomorrow." "Good," she said, and kissed him again. He did not sleep in the bunkhouse after the second week of May. He slept in the small bedroom off the office that had been her father's, with the door properly closed and everything conducted with the discretion that the frontier demanded of people in their circumstances, because she had a reputation and a business, and she was not careless with either. But he was there, and his presence in the house changed the quality of the air in it, filled it with something that she had not known was missing until it arrived. She told him things about her mother, who had died when she was 11, about her years of teaching school in St. Louis, the children whose names she still remembered, the small dignities and small cruelties of that life, about the books she wanted to read and had not found time for, about the fact that she had always wanted to see San Francisco. He listened to all of it with the focused attention that she had come to understand was one of his primary characteristics, this quality of being entirely present when he was with you, and he told her things in return, not all of them easy or comfortable, but all of them true. She learned his full history in pieces. He was 29 years old, born in 1854 in a small town in Missouri, to a father who had been a farmer and then a failed merchant, and then a man with a grievance that eventually consumed his entire personality. His mother had left when he was 7, which he described without drama, but which she recognized as a wound that had shaped a great deal. He had 2 years of formal schooling, and had educated himself beyond that through books acquired in various ways, some of them respectable. He had spent his early 20s in the orbit of men who dressed their criminality in ideology, and he had been, he said plainly, stupid enough for long enough to do real harm before he understood what he was actually participating in. "Do you regret it?" she asked once. "Every day," he said. "Not in a way that incapacitates me anymore, but yes, every day." She believed him, and believing him was not naive, she thought, but informed. She had watched him for 6 weeks, and she knew the difference between guilt as performance and guilt as a genuine fact of a person's interior life, and his was the latter. She had been intending to ask him, when the timing felt right, about his plans regarding the legal question. Whether he intended to approach the marshal's office, whether there was a lawyer he could consult, whether the specific circumstances of his participation at Copper Ridge, which had been limited, as far as she understood, to holding horses outside the building, could be argued toward a lesser charge. She had been turning over practical questions in the same way she turned over freight logistics, methodically and with an eye toward solutions. And then the letter arrived. She had been sitting at the kitchen table for 20 minutes when she heard the horses in the yard, and then Oliver's voice greeting them, which meant he had come back to the property. She did not move. She heard him walk to the shed and then back out and then pause, and she knew the pause meant he was looking at the house and sensing something, because he was very good at sensing things. He knocked on the kitchen door before opening it, which he had started doing 3 weeks ago as a small gesture of respect that she had never asked for and had found unexpectedly moving. "Stella," he said. She looked up at him from the table. She was aware of how she must look, very still and very composed in the way that meant the opposite of composed. His eyes moved to the envelope on the table. He crossed to her in 3 steps and picked it up and read it standing beside her, and she watched his face as he read it, and his face did not do what she expected. She expected guilt. She expected the particular micro-expression of someone caught, the involuntary flinch of a dark secret exposed. What she saw instead was a complicated grief, mixed with something that looked like resignation and something else that looked like fear, and none of it was the expression of someone whose scheme had been discovered. He set the letter down. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her. "I know what this says," he said, "and I know how it looks." "Tell me how it actually is," she said. Her voice was even and controlled and gave away absolutely nothing. "Marshal Holt has been looking for me for 14 months, he said. "He is a thorough and determined man. He will have found out I was working here through one of the freight contacts, most likely the Laramie office, which would have records." He paused. "The reward amount is accurate. The suspicion of the Copper Ridge robbery is accurate. The implication that I came here with a hidden motive is not accurate." He held her gaze. "I did not come here for any reason except the one I told you. I saw your sign. I needed work. I needed somewhere that felt less like the life I was trying to leave. Can you prove that?" She said, "No," he said, "not in a way that would satisfy a marshal or a court, but it is true." She looked at him for a long moment. Something was happening in her chest that was not entirely rational. There was fear there, real fear, both the practical kind about what a wanted man's continued presence on her property meant for her and her business, and the older, more personal kind about opening her heart to something that was going to hurt her. But underneath both of those was something else, something quieter and more insistent, which was her own knowledge of him. 6 weeks of close observation and honest conversation, and shared dawn silences and a Sunday afternoon in the office, and 3 weeks of evenings that had been among the best of her adult life. She knew this man, not perfectly, not without uncertainty, but she knew him well enough to know the difference between what the letter implied and what she had actually watched him be. "You were going to Laramie," she said, "when you left this morning." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to speak to a lawyer," he said. "There is a man in Laramie named Eversham who handles territorial criminal cases. I wanted to understand my options before the situation resolved itself without my input." He looked at his hands. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to worry you until I knew what the options actually were." "That was the wrong decision," she said. "I know that," he said. "I realized it about 3 miles down the road." She looked at him sharply. "Is that why you came back?" He met her eyes. "Yes," he said. "I came back because you deserved to know what I was doing and I had been wrong to not tell you, and because the idea of you being here not knowing where I was or why I had left was something I found I could not accept." She was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the late morning sky was blue and clean and entirely indifferent to the complicated situation in this kitchen. "Oliver," she said. "Yes." "You are going to go to Laramie," she said. "But I am going with you, and we are going to see this lawyer together. And then we are going to understand the exact nature of the situation and make decisions accordingly. And you are not going to make decisions that affect both of us without consulting me again." She paused. "Is that clear?" He stared at her. "You said both of us," he said. "I am aware of what I said." "You're not angry at me," he said slowly, as if the realization were arriving in pieces. "I am somewhat angry at you," she said, "but not for the reason the letter wants me to be." She picked up the letter and folded it again. "I am angry that you were planning to handle this alone when you did not have to." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, as if someone had handed him something he had not expected and he was not entirely sure it was real. "Stella," he said. "Don't," she said. "We will talk properly later. Right now I need to tell Gus that we are going to Laramie tomorrow and that he is in charge of the station, and then I need to write a response to Marshal Holt that is carefully worded enough to buy us a few days." She stood up from the table. And you need to tell me everything about Copper Ridge that you have not already told me, including any details that make you look worse rather than better, because I cannot help you if I am working with incomplete information." "You want to help me," he said. "Yes," she said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that was one of the things he loved most about her. "Now come to the office. I'll get pen and paper." She walked out of the kitchen and he sat for a moment longer at the table, and his chest felt as if someone had taken something heavy and cold that had been sitting in it for 14 months and carefully, precisely removed it. He followed her to the office. The conversation that followed was 2 hours long and covered everything. He told her about Copper Ridge in full. The planning, the execution, the 3 men who had gone inside while he waited with the horses, the 15 minutes that had lasted a subjective lifetime, the faces of the people coming out of the bank, the specific and terrible moment when he had understood from the sounds, and then from the faces of the men running out that it had gone worse than planned, that there had been a shooting, that a bank clerk named Davis had been pistol-whipped into unconsciousness. Nobody had died. He had understood later that this was the primary reason he had not been more aggressively pursued in the immediate aftermath, that the resources had gone after the men who had been inside, the men who were the greater crime. He told her about the 14 months since. The moving, the attempts at legitimate work, the way legitimate work kept bumping up against a past that was difficult to outrun in a territory where everyone knew everyone's business eventually. The genuine turn, which had not been dramatic or sudden but slow and grinding and occasionally humiliating, toward wanting to be someone different. She listened to all of it and asked precise questions and wrote certain things down and did not, at any point, look at him with the expression he had feared, the one of disappointed judgment. When he had finished, she sat back in her father's chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The fact that you were outside is significant," she said. Legally, yes. You participated in the planning and execution of a robbery, so you are not innocent. But the specific circumstances of your participation and the fact that you were not inside during the assault on the clerk may affect the charge and the sentence." She looked at him. "Eversham will know better than I do. But I think there is room to negotiate. I need to turn myself in," he said. "That was the part I had decided on the road. I cannot keep running. It is not who I want to be anymore." "I know," she said quietly. "I think you have known that for a while." "Yes," he said, "but knowing and doing are different." "They are," she agreed. "And for what it's worth, the fact that you were going to Laramie this morning to start the process before this letter arrived matters to me. Even though I didn't tell you." "Even though you didn't tell me," she said, "though you should have." "I should have," he agreed. She looked at him across the desk. "Oliver, I need you to understand something. I am not unaware of the risk to my business and my reputation that is associated with the situation we are in. I have worked very hard to build something here and I cannot be cavalier about it." She paused. "But I am also not unaware of who you are, separate from your worst decisions. And those two things together are what are driving my choices right now, not naivety, not sentiment, and not a hidden motive of my own." She held his gaze. "I am choosing to help you because I believe it is the right thing to do, and because I love you, and those two reasons feel entirely consistent to me." The silence after that was different from any silence that had come before. It was full of something that had arrived and settled and was not leaving. "I will spend a long time trying to be worth that," he said. "Don't try to be worth it," she said. "Just be the person you actually are. That's already what I chose." They left for Laramie the following morning. Gus Prewitt watched them go from the gate with his usual expression of deliberate blankness that covered, Stella knew, a deep current of feeling. She had told him enough that he understood the situation in its broad outlines, and he had listened and then said, "I'll keep the operation straight." And then, after a pause, "You're doing the right thing, Miss Maddox," which from Gus was equivalent to a lengthy speech. Dewey Birch said, "I think you two are going to be all right," with 19-year-old confidence, and Stella had squeezed his shoulder and told him to check the water troughs twice a day, and he had nodded very seriously. The road to Laramie was 40 miles of territory that was beautiful in the relentless, indifferent way of the Wyoming high plains. They drove the lighter wagon, one horse, a good pace. The conversation in the first miles was practical, preparation for the meeting with Eversham, but it shifted over the middle stretch into something quieter and more fundamental, the kind of talking that happens between people who are facing something difficult together and have chosen to be honest about how they feel about that. "Are you frightened?" she asked him at one point. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Of what specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "Of the consequence being larger than you can work with. Of you being harmed by your association with me. Of the version of me that built this life here over the last 6 weeks being required to account for the version of me that held those horses in 1882, and those two versions being in fundamental conflict." He paused. "And if I am honest, of losing what this has been, of losing you." She reached over and put her hand on his arm briefly and then returned it to her lap. "That is a reasonable set of fears," she said. "I would be worried if you weren't frightened." "Are you frightened?" "Of some of the same things," she said, "and of caring this much about an outcome I cannot fully control. That is the thing that I find most difficult." "You like to control outcomes," he said. "I like to control outcomes," she confirmed. "It's a character trait that serves me well in freight management and less well in emotional situations." "I think it serves you well in both," he said. "You're managing this situation with a great deal more precision than most people could." "I'm terrified under the precision," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes the precision more impressive, not less." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road ahead with that steady attention he brought to driving, competent and unhurried, and she thought for the 100th time how she had not expected this, had not expected any of it, the man or the feeling or the particular quality of being known in the way he seemed to know her, accurately and without agenda. "Oliver," she said, "when this is settled, however it settles," she kept her eyes on the road ahead, "I want you to stay at Silver Creek, properly. Not as the man I hired and not as the man who is temporarily here while we sort out a legal situation, but as the person I am building my life with." She paused. "If that is something you want." He was very still beside her for a moment. "It is everything I want," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone saying something they have wanted to say for a long time and are surprised to find the words available. "Good," she said, in that decisive way of hers that he loved. "Then that is the plan." They arrived in Laramie in the late afternoon and took rooms at a respectable boarding house on the main street. They sent word to Eversham's office that evening and received a reply by 8 o'clock the next morning that he would see them at 9. Hiram Eversham was a small, compact man of perhaps 55 with extremely well-groomed white whiskers and the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had been navigating the complexities of territorial law for a long time and was not easily alarmed by complications. He listened to Oliver's account of Copper Ridge with his hands folded on his desk and his expression attentive, and he asked questions at intervals that were sharp and specific, the kind of questions that illuminated what he considered the legally relevant detail. When Oliver had finished, Eversham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your voluntary disclosure and your intent to turn yourself in are significant mitigating factors. The specific nature of your participation, exterior to the building during the assault on the clerk, is relevant. The clerk himself survived and I believe is currently employed at a bank in Denver, which removes the most serious potential charge." He tapped his desk thoughtfully. "A charge of conspiracy to commit robbery and accessory before the fact is more likely than a primary robbery charge. With voluntary surrender, a demonstrated record of law-abiding conduct over the intervening period," he glanced at Stella meaningfully, "and appropriate representation, I believe we are looking at a negotiated outcome that would likely not exceed 18 months to 2 years served, with the possibility of reduced to 12 with good conduct." Oliver absorbed this quietly. 18 months. 2 years. Not indefinite. Not the rest of his life. The alternative, Eversham continued, is to continue as you are, which, given that Marshal Holt has your location, is not a sustainable alternative in any case. I understand, Oliver said. I want to surrender. I have wanted to surrender for some time. I just needed to understand the landscape first. Eversham looked at him with the slight softening of someone who has heard many stories and is recognizing the genuine article in this one. Then let us arrange the terms, he said. The surrender was arranged for the following morning. Eversham contacted Marshal Holt, who arrived from his office 40 miles distant with a promptness that suggested he had been expecting this particular message. He was a solid, gray-haired man in his late 40s who looked at Oliver with the combination of professional respect and personal wariness that law enforcement reserves for men whose files they have been carrying for over a year, and he looked at Stella with something that she chose to interpret as surprise and that she suspected was closer to admiration. "You are Miss Maddox," he said. "I sent you a letter." "You did," she said. "It was not the most favorable introduction." "No," he agreed. He turned back to Oliver. "Mr. Underwood, you are formally placing yourself in custody." "I am," Oliver said, "and you are aware of the charges under consideration." "I am. I am represented by Mr. Eversham, and I believe we have the basis for a negotiated agreement." Holt looked at him for a moment. "The clerk who was assaulted," he said, "a man named John Davis. He wrote a statement 3 months ago. In it he said that the man who stopped the worst assault, who pulled one of the robbers back when things were escalating, was described as coming from outside. Dark hair, gray coat, did not otherwise participate in the robbery itself. We have not been able to establish who that was." He paused. "Do you know anything about that?" Oliver was very still. "I pulled Rennie Walsh back from Davis," he said quietly. "Walsh was going further than the plan. I pulled him back and I told him to stop. Then I went back to the horses." Holt looked at him for another long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, as if something he had been trying to square for a long time had finally clicked into alignment. "That will be included in the record," he said. Stella had to work very hard to maintain her composure in the next few minutes. The knowledge that he had done that, in that moment, at the likely cost of some degree of his own concealment, was not a surprise to her. Not exactly. But it moved her in a way that she needed a moment to process privately. Oliver was taken into legal custody that morning, and Eversham began the formal negotiations immediately. And Stella spent the next 4 days in Laramie managing what could be managed from a distance, sending correspondence back to Gus, and making one trip back to Silver Creek in the middle of that period to handle a freight delivery that could not wait. The trial, such as it was a formal hearing rather than a full jury proceeding, the agreement having been substantially reached before it came to that, and it took place 6 weeks later. Oliver pled to conspiracy before the fact and accessory. The pulling back of Walsh from Davis, now officially on record, was cited in mitigation. The voluntary surrender and clean record in the intervening period were cited. Eversham argued with precision and without theatrics, and the judge, a man named Corin who had been on the territorial bench for 10 years and had seen the full range of what the West produced in the way of human complexity, sentenced Oliver Underwood to 14 months in the territorial facility, with credit for time served since surrender and the possibility of reduced sentence for good conduct. He looked at Stella from across the courtroom as the sentence was read, and she held his gaze, steady and clear, and he put everything he felt into that look, knowing she would read it correctly, which she did. 14 months. She could do 14 months. She drove home to Silver Creek that afternoon and sat on the porch and watched the evening light change across the hills and told herself, calmly and practically, that 14 months was a defined period with a clear end, and that she had things to do in the meantime, which was true. She built. She spent the 14 months building. She renegotiated the Territorial Savings Bank debt from a position of marginally improved leverage, having secured 2 additional freight contracts in the spring, and by midsummer of 1883, she had reduced the outstanding amount to something that was manageable rather than suffocating. She hired an additional full-time hand, a quiet, steady man from Missouri named Leonard Cole, who turned out to be an excellent freighter and an even better hand with horses. She brought Dewey Birch on full-time and began teaching him the bookkeeping, which he turned out to be surprisingly good at once the initial panic of arithmetic subsided. She wrote to Oliver twice a week and he wrote back with the same regularity, and the letters were, she realized as she read them and kept them in a small box in her office, some of the most beautiful and honest writing she had encountered, including in the books on her shelf. He wrote about books he was reading, because the facility had a small library. He wrote about the men he was confined with, carefully and without judgment. He wrote about the work he was doing in the prison carpentry workshop, which was genuine skilled work rather than punishment labor, and about the way physical work organized his mind. He wrote about Copper Ridge, in more detail now that there was no legal reason to be guarded, and about the specific weight of the 14 months of running before he arrived at Silver Creek, and about what it felt like to have the running stop. He wrote about what he was looking forward to. He wrote about the small, particular details of this, and about the future in careful, deliberate terms, as if he were building something in words the way he built things with his hands, precise and patient. She wrote back with equal honesty. She told him about the business. She told him about the freight loads and the difficult clients and the occasional magnificent days when everything worked exactly as it should. She told him about Gus, who had been diagnosed by a traveling doctor with a moderate heart complaint and was being made to rest against every instinct he possessed. She told him about the books she was reading. She told him about the mornings when she stood at the eastern fence and watched the light come up and thought of the morning they had stood there together. She visited him once a month. The facility in Rawlins was a day and a half by train from Laramie, and she made the trip with a regularity that she knew was noted and remarked upon by various people, and did not particularly care. When she visited, they sat across a table in a room with other visitors and talked for 2 hours, and it was at once the most difficult and most sustaining 2 hours of each month. He looked, she noted with the relief of it, like himself. He was losing the haunted quality he had carried when they met, the constant low alertness of someone expecting the past to catch up. In its place was something quieter and more grounded. "You look better," she told him on the 3rd visit. "I sleep properly now," he said. "It is a strange thing. I could not sleep properly for 14 months while I was running, and now that I am in a room with bars on the window I sleep like a stone. I think the anxiety of waiting for a thing is worse than the thing itself for me. That is consistent with everything else I know about you," she said. "And you," he said, "how are you sleeping?" "Less than I'd like," she admitted, "but I'm managing." "Stella," he said, and the way he said her name in that room quietly with the full weight of everything between them in it, made her want to reach across the table and take his hands, which she was not supposed to do beyond the brief permitted touch at greeting and departure. "You don't have to come every month." "I know," she said. "I come because I want to. Don't tell me how to manage my time." He looked at her with something that was the closest thing to laughter available in his current circumstances, that deep, private amusement that softened his face. "I would never be so foolish," he said. She reached across the table and pressed his hand briefly, in the permitted way, and he turned his hand over and held her fingers for the moment aloud, and that was enough for now, she told herself. That was enough because it had to be, and because what was on the other side of the 14 months was worth the patience required to reach it. He was released in November of 1884, having served 12 months with 2 months reduced for conduct and work, exactly as Eversham had predicted. She drove to Rawlins herself to meet him. She had been awake since before dawn, had been unable to eat breakfast, had checked the horses 3 times before the driver Leonard confirmed they were perfectly fine and in excellent condition. She sat straight-backed on the wagon seat for the hour she waited outside the facility after arriving, and watched the door. And when it opened and he walked out into the November morning sun, lean and quiet and blinking slightly in the light, still the same, still himself, she got down from the wagon with considerably less dignity than she usually managed and crossed the distance between them quickly. He caught her without any of the awkwardness of people who have not held each other in a long time, as if no time had passed at all, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in cold air and wool and the particular quality of his presence, which was something she had been carrying in memory for 12 months and was now real again, solid and present and here. "Hello," he said, against her hair. "Hello," she said. She pulled back and looked at him. He looked at her. The morning light was very clear and very cold, and the Wyoming sky above them was the deep, faultless blue of late autumn. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said. "Are you?" "Better now," she said, and he understood exactly what she meant, which was one of the fundamental pleasures of being known by someone who pays attention. They drove back to Laramie and then to Silver Creek over the following day and a half, and the conversation was not the conversation of people who have not seen each other, but of people who have been talking continuously and are now simply doing it in person again, which was right, which was exactly how it should be. Silver Creek received him back the way places receive people who belong to them, without ceremony but with a kind of settling, as if a piece that had been absent had returned to its correct position. Gus shook his hand without speaking and held it for a moment, and that was the most Gus had ever communicated in a single gesture. Dewey said, "Welcome back, Mr. Underwood. The axle on Wagon 2 is making a noise again," which was so purely Dewey that Oliver laughed. Leonard Cole, who had not met Oliver before, studied him for a moment with the frank assessment of a man who takes the measure of people carefully, and then extended his hand and said, "Good to have you," and seemed to mean it. The first evening back, they sat on the porch together in the cold November air with blankets and hot coffee and watched the stars come out over the territory, and Stella said, without preamble, "I want to get married." He turned to look at her. "Is that a proposal?" "I prefer to think of it as a statement of intent," she said. "I have been thinking about it for 12 months and I have no reason to wait any further." "You could have let me ask," he said. "You were in Rawlins," she pointed out. "I have been out of Rawlins for approximately 36 hours. And you haven't asked," she said. "So I am asking. Oliver Underwood, I love you and I would like to be married to you, and I believe we would be extremely good at it. What do you say?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen before, something very open and very clear, entirely without the careful reserve that he generally carried. "Yes," he said. "Obviously yes. Without any hesitation, yes." "Good," she said, and leaned against his shoulder. And he wrapped the blanket around both of them, and she felt the long exhale of the tension she had been holding all year leave her body. And the night was very cold and very quiet and very full of stars, and she was entirely at peace. They were married in the spring of 1885, in a small ceremony at the Silver Creek station house that was attended by Gus and Dewey and Leonard, and a handful of the freight contractors she had developed relationships with and trusted, and a woman named Ruth Havershaw who ran the Cheyenne Millinery and had become something close to a friend over the previous year of correspondence and occasional visits. It was not an elaborate wedding. Stella wore her best dress, a deep blue wool that she had purchased in Laramie, and which set off the amber of her eyes in a way that made Oliver look at her as she came out of the house, and then look away, and then look back, as if he needed a moment to adjust to the specific force of her. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister named Caulfield, who served a circuit of stations and small settlements, and who had a practical and warm manner that suited the occasion. The vows they spoke were the traditional ones, but they had added to them, by private agreement, a single additional clause that they had written together at the kitchen table one evening. "And I will tell you the truth when it is inconvenient, and ask for help when I need it, and not manage difficulties alone when we could face them together." The minister had read this addition without expression, but with what appeared to be sincere approval. After the ceremony, Ruth Havershaw produced a remarkable apple cake from the wagon she had driven down from Cheyenne, which turned out to be one of the most significant contributions to the celebration. And Dewey Birch made a speech that was more endearing for its rambling quality than it would have been had he known what he wanted to say. And Gus said absolutely nothing, but drank a full glass of wine, which was the most celebratory gesture anyone had ever observed him make. Oliver danced with her on the flat ground between the station house and the freight shed, in the May evening with the last light going gold and amber over the hills, to a fiddle that Leonard played with unexpected skill. And she laughed at something he said, and he spun her carefully, and she came back to him, and they stood for a moment in the middle of the music with their foreheads together. And it was the kind of moment that does not require words or witness to be complete. That summer, they worked the freight operation together as true partners, the distinction between employer and employee long since made irrelevant. Oliver's skills extended beyond carpentry and horsework. He had a particular talent for the logistical planning of routes and contracts that complemented her financial precision in a way that made the operation measurably more efficient. By the end of the 1885 freight season, they had paid off the last of Thomas Maddox's debt to the Territorial Savings Bank, which was something Stella had not been certain she would live to see. She stood at the kitchen table the morning she received the bank's letter confirming the debt had been cleared, and she read it twice, and then set it down very carefully and put her hands flat on the table and closed her eyes for a moment. Oliver, who had been in the office, came to the kitchen doorway and saw her expression. "Good news or bad?" he said. She looked up at him. "The bank debt is cleared," she said. He crossed to her in 2 steps and put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and she grabbed the front of his shirt and held on for a moment, and neither of them spoke for a little while. "Your father would be proud," he said finally. "He would be difficult and skeptical and eventually proud," she said. "Which amounts to the same thing," he laughed. "Yes, that sounds right." Gus Pruitt, whose heart complaint was being managed with moderate success by a doctor in Cheyenne on a quarterly basis, announced that summer that he intended to retire. He said this with the same bleak practicality with which he said everything, but underneath it was something that looked very much like a man who was finally allowing himself to stop. He had been running since Thomas Maddox's time, maintaining things, holding things together, not stopping because stopping felt like giving something up. Now, with the operation secure and in good hands, he seemed to understand that stopping was permission rather than failure. Oliver helped him move his belongings to a small house in Laramie where his sister lived, and drove him there on a Wednesday afternoon in September. And on the way, Gus said, in the longest speech he had given in the years Stella had known him, "She is a good woman, and she deserved good things, and I am glad it worked out." Oliver said, "So am I," and Gus said, "Don't mess it up," and Oliver said, "I will try very hard not to," and Gus appeared satisfied with this and did not speak again for the rest of the drive. In the winter of 1885, Stella told Oliver she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen, which was becoming the setting for the most significant moments of their shared life, at breakfast on a Thursday morning, matter-of-factly, watching his face for the reaction. He was very still for a moment. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table and knelt beside her chair and took her hands in both of his, and he looked up at her with an expression so nakedly moved that she felt her composure waver in a way she generally did not permit. "Are you well?" He said. "Perfectly well," she said. "Dr. Sayers in Laramie confirms it. He expects the birth in July." "July," he repeated, as if placing the word in the calendar of his life and watching it change everything around it. "Are you all right?" she said. He turned her hands over in his and looked at them for a moment. "I am thinking," he said quietly, "about the version of myself that existed 3 years ago in the years before Silver Creek, and I am thinking about this moment, and the distance between those two things is something I am having difficulty measuring." "Don't measure it," she said. "Just be here." He pressed his mouth to her hands. "I am here," he said. "I am entirely here. The pregnancy was, by the standards of the Wyoming Territory in 1885, uncomplicated. Stella was healthy and disciplined, and made exactly the concessions required by her condition, and not a single one beyond those. Oliver made himself useful in the practical ways available to him without becoming anxious or hovering, which she had made clear she found intolerable, and he had a deep natural gift for identifying what was actually needed and providing it without fanfare or comment. Ruth Havershaw came from Cheyenne in June and stayed through the birth, which happened, as predicted, in early July on a hot morning when the freight operation was running at full capacity, and Stella had been insisting as recently as 2 days prior that she was perfectly capable of reviewing the accounts. The baby was a boy. Oliver held him first, before the exhaustion of birth had quite reclaimed Stella, and she watched from the pillow as Oliver held this new small person and looked at him with an expression she recognized from certain specific mornings at the eastern fence line. The same quality of careful attention to something beautiful, the same contained wonder, and she thought that perhaps this was who he had always been underneath everything else. This man who paid extraordinary attention to the world and felt it all very deeply, and had simply had no safe place to put any of it until now. They named him Thomas James Underwood. Thomas for her father and James for Oliver's, the gesture of including the imperfect fathers, a kind of reckoning with the past that seemed right. Thomas James Underwood was a boy of strong opinions and excellent health who made his presence known from the first weeks with a voice that carried remarkably well for someone so small, and who developed, as he grew, the disconcerting habit of looking at people with a gaze that seemed to be assessing their full character, which both his parents recognized as a trait that had not skipped a generation. Life at Silver Creek in the years that followed had the quality of something that has found its right form. Not without difficulty or complexity. The freight operation had years of better and worse performance, and there were droughts that affected the cattle country they served and railroad expansions that changed some routes and required renegotiating. And there were illnesses and difficult winters, and the ordinary accumulated troubles of a life built in a hard and beautiful place. But the ground of it was solid. The ground of it was built of 2 people who had each arrived at Silver Creek carrying significant and different damage, and who had, through a combination of honesty and patience, and the willingness to be known fully rather than selectively, built something that held. Oliver turned his full attention to the freight business and to the land, and over the years became someone whom the other operators in the territory respected for his reliability and his precise intelligence about routes and weather, and the particular logistics of moving goods through difficult terrain. He was not loud about any of it. He did not need to be the most prominent person in any room, and Stella, who had grown up watching men perform their competence for an audience, found this quality in him one of the things she loved most consistently, across the full length of their shared life. She ran the business side with the precision and tenacity that had kept the station alive through the years before he arrived, but now with a partner who could be trusted completely, which changed the fundamental quality of the work from something she was holding together by force of will alone to something they were building together by choice. They added to the station over the years: a proper barn to replace the aging shed, a larger bunkhouse, a second freight wagon, and eventually a small addition to the main house that gave Thomas a room of his own and created a study that was genuinely Stella's, with shelves that held an expanding collection of books and the neatly organized records of 12 years of operation. 3 years after Thomas, there was another child. A girl this time, born in the spring of 1889 with a crown of dark hair like her father and a fixed, considering expression that made the midwife say, half laughing, "This one knows exactly what she thinks." They named her Clara Ruth, Ruth for the Cheyenne milliner who had become a genuine friend and had been at both births. Clara Ruth Underwood was a different kind of person from her brother from the beginning, Where Thomas was observant and methodical, Clara was interested in everything and moved through the world with a velocity that kept both her parents in a constant state of careful management. She climbed things she should not climb and went to places she had not been told to go, and asked questions at a rate that occasionally made even Stella, who valued honesty and directness, need to request a brief interval for recovery. Oliver was, with his children, the person Stella had seen glimpses of from the very beginning, patient and specific, genuinely interested in them as people rather than simply fond of them in the general parental way. He taught Thomas to drive the freight wagon at 11 and to keep the accounts at 12, and Thomas proved to have the same combination of his father's logistics instinct and his mother's financial precision that made people around him occasionally stop and look at him with that particular expression of recognition that appears on older faces when they see someone becoming something they will one day be. He taught Clara to ride properly and to read maps and to shoe a horse, and Clara combined all of these skills into a general insistence on going everywhere and doing everything, which Oliver supported without reservation and Stella supported with slightly more careful attention to which specific things and which specific places. Dewey Birch married a girl from Cheyenne named Annabelle in 1887 and brought her to meet the Underwoods with the pride of a young man who cannot quite believe his own good fortune. Annabelle was practical and funny and became, over the following years, one of Stella's preferred people, and the four of them had dinner together regularly and argued about territorial politics with a warmth that was essentially its own form of affection. Leonard Cole stayed on at Silver Creek through the end of the decade, and then, in 1890, bought a small stake of land of his own 20 miles south and became a rancher, which had been his intention all along, and which Stella supported by using her freight contracts to ensure he had reliable transport for his cattle, because that was the kind of person she was, practical in her loyalties and loyal in her practicality. Gus Prewitt died peacefully in Laramie in the winter of 1888, in his sister's house, in his sleep. Stella received the letter on a Monday morning and sat with it for a long time. Oliver came in from the yard and found her at the kitchen table with the letter in her hands and her expression very still, and he sat down across from her and waited, because he had learned over the years when she needed to talk and when she needed to simply not be alone, and this was the latter. After a while she said, "He was the most consistently decent person I have known in the aggregate." "Yes," Oliver said. "He never said unnecessary things," she said. "I find that quality rarer and more valuable the longer I live." "He knew that you were worth the staying," Oliver said. "He stayed because he knew that." She looked up at him. "So did you," she said. "I came back 3 miles down the Laramie road," he said. "That is not quite the same as staying for 7 years." "It is the beginning of it," she said. "That is what you did not know. When you turned that horse around, you were already choosing all of this. You just didn't know the full shape of what you were choosing yet." He reached across the table and she put her hand in his. "I knew enough," he said. She considered this. "Yes," she said, "I suppose you did." They sat quietly for a while in the kitchen that had held so many of their most important moments, the table between them worn smooth by years of use, and the light coming in at the same angle it always had in the morning, and the yard outside full of the sounds of a working operation, and the far horizon of the Wyoming hills unchanged and permanent and entirely indifferent to human time, and within that indifference, enduring. The Wyoming Territory became the state of Wyoming in July of 1890, which was a fact of historical significance that the Underwood household marked by Stella reading the announcement aloud from the Cheyenne newspaper at breakfast, and Oliver saying, "44th State," and Thomas, who was 5 and very interested in numbers, insisting on being told what number it would have been if Wyoming had entered the Union at a different time, which led to a conversation that lasted through the meal and into the yard. The state of Wyoming had, notably, granted women the right to vote in 1869 as a territorial provision, which Stella had exercised as a matter of straightforward principle in every available election since arriving in the territory, and which she had explained to Thomas and Clara in terms that she considered non-negotiable basics about the nature of civic life. Oliver's position on this had been consistent from the first discussion of it. Obviously, he had said. What else would be the position, which she had appreciated with the force of someone who had encountered a great deal of other positions? By the early 1890s, the Silver Creek Freight Company, as it was now formally named in the Company Register of Laramie County, was one of the more reliable operations in the region. Not the largest. There were operations backed by Eastern capital that had grown into enterprises of a different scale. But Silver Creek had what Stella had always intended it to have, which was a reputation for reliability and honesty that brought back the same clients year after year, and which rested on the foundation of a family that had built it out of difficulty and debt and dark past, and the particular combination of two people who had found each other at exactly the right and the wrong moment, and had decided that the finding mattered more than the difficulty. Thomas Underwood, at 15, was driving freight routes with Oliver 2 days a week, and doing the accounts every evening after supper with a focus that made Stella feel, watching him, the specific bittersweet thing that comes from recognizing yourself in your child. He had begun to talk about expanding the company's routes north, toward the new settlements developing along the Powder River country, and his maps of the proposed routes were detailed and carefully annotated in a hand that was becoming, unmistakably, his own. Clara Underwood, at 12, had declared her intention to become a lawyer, on the grounds that she had questions about a great many things and wanted the professional authority to require answers. Oliver had looked at Stella over Clara's head with an expression of complex pride, and Stella had said, "Then you will need to be very good at mathematics." And Clara had said, "I already am," which was the kind of thing that was difficult to argue with because it was true. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary, Stella and Oliver sat on the same porch where they had spent so many evenings, with the May night warm around them and the stars very clear, and the operation quiet for the evening. And they had wine, the good bottle that had been set aside specifically for this occasion, and they sat in the comfortable silence of people who have lived 10 years together closely and honestly, and have no particular need to fill the air with anything but presence. "Tell me something you haven't told me," she said eventually. It was something they did occasionally, this request, a practice they had kept from the early days of knowing each other, the refusal to stop being interesting to each other. He thought about it for a moment. "In the first week I was here," he said, "I found one of your father's notebooks in the shed. It had notes about the operation in it, but also, on the last few pages, a letter to you that he had never finished, about how proud he was of what you were doing. How he knew it was harder than you let on, and how he thought you were one of the strongest people he had known." He paused. "I put it back where I found it. I did not tell you because I did not think it was mine to share. But I have thought about it often." Stella was very still. "Where is the shed?" she said, and her voice was very quiet. "Second shelf from the left, behind the spare harness straps," he said. She went in the next morning before anyone else was up and found the notebook and stood in the shed in the early light and read the unfinished letter. It was in her father's handwriting, precise and slightly cramped, the way he wrote when he was writing something important. It said what Oliver had described. It said more than that, too. It said he was sorry for the years when he had not said enough, and that he had watched her come west and take hold of something difficult and make it work, and had not found the right words often enough. She folded the letter back into the notebook and stood there for a moment in the shed smell of hay and leather and old wood, and then she walked out into the yard where Oliver was feeding the horses. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He looked at her over the fence. His eyes were very clear in the morning light. "I should have told you sooner." "No," she said. "You told me when it was right to tell me." He came over the fence to where she was standing, and she leaned against him, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the early morning for a while, the way they had stood at the fence on an April morning years ago when they barely knew each other, and the sun was coming up over the same hills, and the hills had not changed at all, and they had changed enormously, and both of those things were true and right. 12 years after Oliver Underwood had turned his horse around 3 miles down the Laramie road and ridden back to a woman he could not leave without telling her where he was going, Stella stood at the kitchen window on a winter morning in 1897 and watched her husband and her son load a freight wagon together in the yard, Oliver showing Thomas something about the rigging with the patient precision that had characterized everything he had ever built or taught. Thomas watching and then trying it himself and getting it right on the first attempt, and Oliver's expression at that success, the quiet fierce pride of it, was one she knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The kitchen smelled of coffee and the breakfast that had just been cleared. Clara was in the study doing schoolwork, her voice occasionally audible as she argued with a mathematics problem. The operation was running well. The bank debt was 10 years gone. The books balanced. The roads were clear. She thought about the letter in the apron pocket, 12 years gone. She thought about sitting at this table not knowing that he had turned back. She thought about what she had believed in those minutes before he knocked on the door. That trust was the trap and openness was the thing you paid for. And she thought about everything that had come after. The porch in the storm and the kitchen at midnight, and the office where he had told her about Copper Ridge and the courtroom and the 12 months of letters, and the May evening of a wedding and 2 children who were becoming people of extraordinary quality, and 12 years of built and tested and trusted partnership that had started with a man knocking on a gate and asking if there was work. She thought about 3 miles. 3 miles, and a decision made without full knowledge of its meaning. A turn of a horse on a road because something in him would not allow him to leave without making certain she was all right, not even knowing then that he loved her, just knowing that he needed to be sure, and that need being the thing that had made everything else possible. She pushed open the kitchen door and went out into the winter yard. Oliver looked up from the wagon. Thomas looked up too, his young face open and attentive in the morning cold. So much both of them, the steadiness and the precision, the quality of presence that had always been his father's finest thing. "Coffee's ready," she said. Oliver smiled at her across the yard. Not a large smile, he had never been a man of large gestures, but warm and certain and entirely real, the smile of someone who has arrived at something he intended to arrive at and who does not take the arriving for granted. "In a moment," he said. "Show Thomas first." "I already know," Thomas said. "Show me you know," Oliver said in the patient tone. Thomas set his jaw with the particular expression that meant he was suppressing a smile, and demonstrated the rigging correctly. And Oliver looked at Stella over their son's head with that quiet expression that meant everything at once. And she stood in the cold winter morning of the Wyoming territory with her heart entirely full, and her feet firmly planted on the ground she had built, and the ground had built into her, and she thought, this is what it is. This is what it looks like when a thing that could have broken stays whole, when the secrets get told and the past gets carried and the 3 miles that matter most are the ones a person rides back. The coffee was hot. The sky was clear. The hills were permanent and beautiful and entirely indifferent, as they had always been and would always be. And in the yard of the Silver Creek Freight Company, on a January morning in 1897, Oliver Underwood finished the lesson and put his arm around his son's shoulders, and they walked together toward the house, and Stella held the door open, and everyone came in out of the cold.